Yeah, they will start with
Portuguese. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Maybe
I know a little bit of Portuguese, but then I can't speak it really well. So learning.
that's good.
Yeah.
So, okay, I think we probably live now. So
Okay.
it's my pleasure to introduce Aritra Halder to our seminar in the department. Aritra is a young, promising statistician. He graduated in the same university as I did, maybe 10, 12 years later. So he's now assistant professor at Drexel University in the US. And from my perspective, he has been working in interesting problems. He may talk about one of them, but he can talk whatever he feels like. So thank you all for being here. And I'll give the word to Aritra. This way he can give his talk and we can move on with the questions at the end. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Marcos, for the very kind introduction and the invitation. we During my PhD, we shared some time where you were visiting University of Connecticut, and it was lovely to meet you, to interact with you, and I learned a lot from you about INLA and spatial statistics and everything. So thank you so much for visiting at that time and also inviting me. So the talk today is basically on uh, a work that I did during my PhD, and it was a very interesting problem in terms of trying to understand uh, whether boundaries, how to evaluate or do uncertainty quantification for boundaries that exist within a geographic or spatial domain, right? So this work kind of goes one step further from your traditional spatial statistical modeling. I'll kind of review the literature a little bit as we get into it, but this work kind of starts off with some motivation that kind of led us to start working on this. So this picks up from a work that was done long back, and it was called, this boundary analysis was typically known as wombling, which was essentially after a scientist called William H. Womble, who was finding basically lurking boundaries that separate two contiguous regions in the geographic space. So the first example that you see here is basically looking at a very standard interpolated spatial surface of temperatures during, like in the northeast US, during the month of January in 2000. So from a layperson's point of view, if you look at the variation, you would say that from like the southern region is a little hotter than the northern region, and there's like change happening in temperature as you move from south to north. It gets colder, right? And associated with that is a probability distribution or a probability density that you can see, which you can plot basically towards your left, right? So traditional spatial statistical modeling would basically look at the points which are in black dots on the right as basically latitudes and longitudes, and build a spatial model using intersite distances between pairs of latitudes and longitudes to see if there is any dependence, which clearly there is, as you can see from your eye, there is. But what if I was interested to kind of look at, let's say, latitudes that cross this region and understand, is there a significant change happening in temperature when I move from, say, latitude, which is at 16 degrees, to latitude 18 degrees, right? How much of the significance is changing when we change latitudes, move more towards the north in terms of latitudes? There's really no answer which is based on the model for questions like this. You would probably say, looking at the latitudes, that maybe you would expect stuff to become a little less significant because the latitude on 16 degrees lies near my mouse pointer, and the latitude on 18 degrees lies again near my mouse pointer here. And the latitude in 18 degrees is pretty flat. You don't see very sharp temperature gradients, but in latitude 16 degrees change, it's starting to get cooler, right? So you would see a lot more gradients there. But they're all like eyeballing. They're not really statistical answers. They are more like qualitative answers. They're looking at the plot. This is what I feel. It's not a quantitative answer which is accompanied by, let's say, a point estimate, a credible interval. There's no such thing, right? So basically, if I'm evaluating boundaries, which are in this case latitudes, I would I I don't have a statistical framework to do it as of yet, right? So let's look at another example. In this example, the boundary which was latitude in the earlier case is now a river that basically flows through a floodplain, right? So if you see the river here, this particular river is the Meuse River, and every plot that you see is a plot for one particular heavy metal that is found in high concentrations in the river bed, right? On the river plane. I'm sorry, not the river bed, but the river plane. So what happens is that industrial waste kind of flows into the river, and then the river hits the river plane, and on the banks of the river, the heavy metals that were offloaded as industrial waste into the river, or kind of offshot into the river as industrial waste, gets offloaded onto the river plain, right? Now, these river plains are very fertile regions. These river plains are used for grazing cattle, they're used for growing crops. So indirectly, these heavy metals enter the human diet or diet of the cattle, right? And you end up seeing diseases that affect your cattle or humans, right? So you really want to have a good quantification of where exactly, how far from the riverbed would you want to go if you would want to graze cattle or grow crops. It's pretty clear by looking at the river plain that you cannot grow crops right next to the river because there are high concentrations of heavy metals. And you can see that depending upon which heavy metal you're looking at, these concentrations display sufficient amount of heterogeneity. So basically, we want to understand, not just do spatial modeling, but understand the effect of the river. Right? And the river is basically, if you think of it in mathematical terms, it's a curve. It's a curve that kind of intersects and weaves its way through the spatial surface, right? So you really not just want to do spatial modeling, but within that spatial modeling framework, you really want to understand what is the effect of the river. Like, how far do I move from the river? If I move a little further from the river, how is the concentration of these heavy metals changing, right? So again, no statistical framework to answer such questions. Okay. Now, this one is another very classical data set, which I think a lot of you have encountered. It's called the Boston housing data. And a lot of models are benchmarked on this data to see if they can do all sorts of fancy statistical things like clustering, etc. Right? So what you see here is a little bit of background for this data set is essentially that people were interested to pay for clean air. Right? So if you're buying a house, of the many concerns that you have that kind of entail the house buying process, you are also looking for, like, you're looking for schools, you're looking for the neighborhood, you're looking for the kind of individuals that settle, you're also looking for air quality, right? So in this particular snapshot of Boston in Massachusetts in the US, uh, there was a lot of industries that were kind of releasing smoke and polluting the air. Right? And people not necessarily wanted to live in close proximity to an industrial belt. And that was happening towards the east side of Boston, right? More towards the west side of Boston, you would essentially, that smoke would not enter into those regions. So what would happen is that house prices in those regions were higher, which is marked in red, and house prices in the regions closer to the industry, which was affected by smoke and bad air quality, is marked in blue, right? So you see that there's a very sharp decrease in house prices as you transition from one. It's smooth, but it's sharp, right? And there are no really, if I were to kind of overlay the county boundary onto this map, you could probably evaluate the boundaries for the counties to see, is this a county that kind of is this the boundary of the county that kind of serves as a separating line in between regions of high house price and regions of very low house price? So to do something like that, you need a statistical framework. Again, so these are like basically three examples from very differing regions where spatial statistical models are being built for. Like, so this particular area of economics or econometrics is mostly focused on doing hedonic price regression models, right? So the hedonic house price models essentially build predictive models for predicting house price. Right? But again, we see in each of these three examples, what we're emphasizing is that there exist boundaries which typically manifest as curves within the spatial reference domain that often demarcate zones of rapid change, right? So that is what prompted us to kind of build a boundary analysis framework that we build to do statistical inference within, of course, a conventional model based, spatially, like a conventional spatial modeling based setup, right? So we don't want to deviate completely far off from that. We don't want to build a separate boundary analysis framework that is not informed by the modeling, because the modeling has a lot of attractive properties, right? So you want to utilize that. You want the response, the models, the covariates to inform change, right? So that is basically a very easy introduction and overview of this work, right? So I'll give you some uh, background regarding spatial modeling. Spatial modeling, as many of you know here, is increasingly growing, and it has started to appear in most spatial like in most applications that entail statistics, right? Because and the primary reason for this is very detailed data being recorded. So the data recording mechanisms are improving over the day. So like for the phone that you have in your hand, like any website you open, you often see like a blue bar pop up with an arrow saying that your location from where you're accessing this website is being recorded, right? So the more and more of location recording going on is producing like a massive amount of spatial data, right? And such data kind of appear in multiple applications like biomedical imaging, environmental and geographical information systems, public health, epidemiology, evidence-based public policy, and so on and so forth, right? But the focus of this work, so this spatial data can be recorded in multiple scales, right? You could record like aerial level data like counties and zip codes, etc., or you could record point level data. The focus of this work is basically point level data, right? So to give you some notation that we use Y, which is basically the conventional way of denoting our response statistics, being indexed by a location S, bold S, right? So that location is basically your latitude and longitude. So you denote the response of interest as YS, right? Now the process is of course observed in finite set of locations. Now, if you remember when I was introducing the examples and the motivation of this work, I was talking about change, right? So this change, or which in math you would understand as gradients or second order gradients, to understand the magnitude and the rate of change, it cannot be learned from finite set of locations. So typically what you do is you work with an interpolated surface, right? So you leverage that interpolated surface, as you saw in these earlier examples, to understand gradients or change in to understand and quantify, of course, change within this spatial domain of reference, right? Now, our interest, like we said before, is basically on these boundaries, these naturally occurring boundaries. It may be mountain ranges, it may be rivers, it may be a boundary that we have constructed, right? So we want to understand the effect of this on the response. Is a lower dimensional structure within a two-dimensional space affecting response that is manifesting over this two-dimensional space, right? So of course, like I said, this has been like attempts have been made to understand and quantify and build a unified framework for this, like which characterizes smoothness for such spatial processes, right? Okay, so the spatial modeling piece that I was talking about is often referred to as spatial learning, which kind of looks at this response YS, spatially indexed response YS, and builds a hierarchical model, right? So this hierarchical model has three parts. The first is a mean function. That mean function often involves covariates of your choice, stuff that has been observed, right? And you want to understand the effect of these observed variables on the variation in this YS, right? So they are often accompanied by regression coefficients beta, right? So which is a vector in this case. And ZS is basically your structured effect, right? So you want to understand not just, so you're hypothesizing that the 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 variation that you see, a part which has been not quantified by these observed covariates, there are two parts to that variation. One is the structured part, which is ZS. The structured, by structure I mean dependence on location, Like there's some dependence that is introduced in between observations ys1 and ys2 because s1 and s2 are close to each other, right? And there is this epsilon s, which is often called white noise or the nugget in this case, which is basically microscale variability, which is the true random noise. So this is the hypothesized hierarchical modeling framework, the way you break up variation in the response, right? So of course, as you can clearly see, there's no variation associated with the covariates, but the variation is kind of broken down into these two major groups. One is the structured variation, which is sigma square, and the other is the variance of this microscale variability associated with epsilon s, right? The nugget, right? And that's tau square. So the overall hypothesized variance is sigma square plus tau square. Now, if you think about change and gradients, if there's a high variance in the spatial features you're looking at, after uh, the effect of the covariates has been quantified, if some of that variance still flows over into the variance of ZS, you would expect sharp peaks and sharp valleys, right? And that would be accompanied by higher order, like high gradients. Right? That would be captured into those high gradients because we are interested in quantifying change in YS. So we are interested in looking for gradients and second order gradients in YS, or we could do the same for ZS, right? The advantage of doing it over ZS is basically you are kind of quantifying the effect of the covariates first, and then you're looking for leftover variability and trying to assess and quantify that. So that in itself is a very attractive thing. But if you were not interested to do that, if you had no covariates, you could affect this directly on YS, right? Okay. So the process parameters, as you can clearly see here, is essentially parameters that are associated with the process ZS and epsilon s, which are collected together with the regression coefficients beta to produce a group like this, right? Now, ZS typically is assigned to be a Gaussian process, right? So the Gaussian process, as many of you are familiar with, has a mean function, is completely specified by a mean function, and a covariance kernel, right? So this K is basically the covariance kernel. It depends upon the interside distance because we're interested in looking at dependence due to location, right? So if S1 and S2 are, or S and S dash here are two locations which are close by or further away, we would want to quantify the dependence through ZS using their location, right? So this S minus S dash is basically the difference in their location, all right? Okay, so the parameters that these kind of covariance matrices or covariance kernels come with are basically this overall variance parameter that I talked about and something called a spatial range. It's also called the length scale parameter, but that's the inverse of the spatial range, right? So it depends on how you parameterize these matrices and these kernels, right? So what the spatial range really talks about is basically how fast does the correlation fall off, right? If you move from location S to S dash, do you see a sharp drop in the response, or do you see it slowly fading off, right? So what is the rate of this drop? So as you can see, all of these are connected with change, right? So you would naturally think intuitively that these would affect my gradients, and they do, right? So this basically creates the hierarchy. This basically outlines the hierarchical spatial model that we want to explore these gradients under, right? Okay, perfect. So now to give you some idea regarding what we're doing, right? So for now, just think of a surface being static, right? So think we have an interpolated surface and it's static, it's not random. So basically when change is manifesting, it's manifesting as a peak, the one that you see here, right? And you want to understand or quantify that if this is a peak, right? Given the variation in the surface, is this really a peak of interest? Is the change that is being enclosed by this peak significant, right? So these are the questions that you would want to answer. So you're generally bounding that region. You're saying that this is a region that I want to explore. It may be a county, it may be a zip code, it may be a boundary that you have constructed using contours, right? So any smooth curve that is bounding this peak is essentially a region of interest which lies inside this geographic space, right? So what this curve has, and the surface in itself also has, is a normal, right? So this surface is basically what the normal does for the surface is basically gives you an orientation as to which way. Like for instance, it's exactly equal to saying that I'm going in the northern direction or I'm going in the eastern direction. So it gives a sense of direction. That's what the normal does, right? Because if you think of it, if you're at any point in this curve and if you're not looking at the peak, you would not be able to understand the right amount of change that you want to quantify, right? So the direction becomes very important. And we are particularly interested in the normal direction to this curve, because think of it, this curve is bounding a peak. So anything that is perpendicular to the curve will face the peak. And that's what we want. We want to understand change in that direction. If this was a one-dimensional case, we would not be interested in direction. Since this is two-dimensional, direction becomes key and principal to be able to understand and quantify change, right? So for instance, if I was standing here in the curve and looking at the opposite way of the peak, I would say that this was decreasing. If I'm looking at the peak, I would say that the response is increasing towards that peak, right? So depending upon which way I'm looking, the nature of change that's being quantified or looked at completely changes, right? So curve being important, and the direction that we are looking at while traversing the curve also becomes important, right? Okay. So how do we do warmling? What is this boundary analysis framework, right? So what we end up doing is that once we have a direction and a curve, what we do is we basically find out the flux, or the total amount of the total intensity of the response that is enclosed within that area. So if you think of it in mathematical terms, all you want to do is evaluate a line integral, right? Because if you want to understand how much of the response or how much of a vector field is contained within a curve, you are essentially interested in line integrals. And that's exactly what warmling entails. It entails line integrals. And of course, if we want to do this when traversing the curve, we are not interested in doing this in estimating any arbitrary line integral. We're interested in estimating the line integral that is accompanying this curve that is bounding a peak, right? Okay, perfect. So now these curves, as you can quite imagine, can be very, very complicated, right? These curves can be smooth, cannot be smooth, can have discontinuities. So depending upon the curve that you're looking at, this line integral can be very complex, right? So we want to make that simpler. So what we want to do is that we want to work with smooth curves. So what do smooth curves mean? Smooth curves in layperson terms would just mean that the smooth curve is such, like a smooth curve is such that at every point on the curve, you can estimate the normal. So that's all we need. We want the normal to exist, right? And we don't directly want to work with a smooth curve. Even if no matter what your choice of software is, you will see that these curves, these contours, whatever you're working with, get stored as a sequence of points. They are very close points, close together, right? But they're always stored as sequences of points or a group of points, right? So this group of points is basically a partition of a smooth curve. Now, depending upon how close these points are, if you plot those points together, you might think that this is a smooth curve that's being plotted because the points are very close together, right? So depending upon how much computational resource you have available, estimating this line integral, you can work with a very coarse partition, few number of points, or you could work with a very fine partition, many points, right? So depending upon what your partition of choice is, the accuracy of estimating this line integral within this spatial surface increases. So that's the trade-off that you want to work with. But regardless of computational resources, this is a strategy which proves very beneficial, because if you can do it for one line segment, you could do it for every line segment, and they don't need to depend on one another. So you could basically do this in parallel if you have multiple cores, right? So this partitioning of the curve offers many, many pros and many, many advantages within a computational setup, right? So these three pictures actually explain exactly what this work does. These three pictures and this model, right? So this is basically what warmling is all about. So now, having said this, I can basically get into some of the math that is entailed. I will not get into too much detail, but to give you just a brief overview, to understand change, when I was explaining the pictures and the examples, what you really required was, you heard me mention gradients and second order gradients, right? So how do these exist? Whenever you're saying that these gradients and these second order gradients exist, you're assuming that the surface is smooth. So you have to have some smoothness considerations for the surface, right? So what does it mean for a surface to be smooth? Think about your high school times, right? These Taylor expansions that existed on a function f, right? So if you assumed that f dash and f double dash, if the function was once differentiable or twice differentiable, Taylor's expansion of that function was what gave you quantifications or mathematical structure to those gradients and to those first order gradients and second order gradients, right? So we do exactly the same, but we do this, let's say, in R2, in a Euclidean space, right? So this y, which was your response of interest is now, if you look at any arbitrary point as 0, what you're assuming is basically a first order Taylor expansion if you're only interested in gradients. If you're interested in gradients and curvature, which is the second order gradients, you're assuming a second order Taylor expansion that allows for both these processes to exist, right? Now, even though they may exist mathematically, mind you, these were all hypothesized. If you remember in this hierarchical spatial modeling framework, these were all hypothesized as Gaussian processes. So they just don't need to be valid in a mathematical sense, but they also need to be valid stochastic processes, right? So what this math, like all of this math, is basically required to establish validity of these stochastic processes together, right? The gradient as a stochastic process, the curvature as a stochastic process. So apart from differentiability, of course, as many of you know, differentiability is the next step to continuity. And we're only interested in mean squared continuity. So in some sense, you can say we're interested in mean squared differentiability. What does mean squared continuity mean? It just means that whatever concept of continuity you have from your math for functions which are just being evaluated at points, attach a concept of squared expectation to it. And that's exactly, the mean is because of the expectation, the squared is because you're interested in the squared absolute difference going to 0, right? So if ys is said to be mean squared continuous, as s approaches s0, you would expect this squared expectation to go to 0, right? Okay. And of course, when we are looking at these peaks, you can imagine that there's a lot of geometry involved. So we use very standard differential geometric notations to formalize developments. If you're interested, look at the paper, right? I will not get into too much detail about the differential geometry part of it. Now, how do we establish validity of these processes, these stochastic processes? Because these are no longer just mathematical objects. They now become stochastic processes, right? So we do that under this Gaussian process assumption using finite differences. And since you know from your standard statistical knowledge that linear functions of Gaussian variables are also Gaussian, you can clearly see from this slide that both your gradients, because the first order finite difference would approximate the directional gradient. The second order finite difference would approximate the directional curvature, right? So together, they would basically form dependent Gaussian processes. And that was what motivated us to kind of shift to establish validity of these processes, that these are valid processes, to shift from the gradient to the finite difference. And we want to observe the finite difference in limit when h goes very small, right? Just working with these would lead to a lot of instability, because depending upon how small h is and the location you're at, these could be arbitrarily large or very small, right? What we're hypothesizing is that in limit, when h tends to 0, this basically gives us the directional gradient, right? So, and we will use that fact to kind of derive joint conditionals and then have a closed form expression for the posterior for particular kernels that will allow you to sample them. And there'll be no arbitrary high values or arbitrary low values, which are unnecessarily caused by this scale h, right? Okay. So what does validity mean? Establishing the validity of a Gaussian process. It just means that the mean and the covariance associated with the process that you're interested in should be clearly specified. There should not be any quantity inside of those matrices or those kernels which just go to infinity or don't exist, right? So what we are saying is that to be able to understand change and quantify change, we need the gradient and the curvature. Now, the curvature, that matrix that you saw, if you think of it in 2 dimensions, they contain repeated derivatives, right? And that's why you need, and we are only interested in the unique derivatives, because del 2 del x del y is the same as del 2 del y del x. So you don't need both, right? So you just need the top half of the matrix, the upper triangular part, right? So combining all of the gradient and the curvature and the original process, what you have is basically a geometric operator, right? Like this calligraphic ly that you want to build inference on, right? Okay. So for this process to be valid, and we assumed that this z was a Gaussian process, or this y is basically a Gaussian process with a mean mu. So most of the times these covariates are constant, they're known, right? So the gradient of a constant function is 0, right? So of course you're working with like mean 0 processes. So all you need, so the mean is clearly specified. All you need is that this covariance matrix that is associated with this directional difference, this directional gradient operator, or just the geometric operator, needs to be valid, right? So everything that's marked in red is corresponding to the gradient. Everything that's marked in blue is corresponding to the curvature. So what I really need is that this matrix should be well-defined, right? And that's exactly what the primary theoretical result does. So as you can clearly see that for this matrix to be well-defined, I need the covariance kernel to be 4th order differential, right? A smooth covariance curve. But it's no problem if it is just second order differentiable, because you know from your standard statistical knowledge that any subvector of a vector valued Gaussian process, not a vector valued Gaussian process, of a Gaussian process, any subvector of finite number of realizations of a Gaussian process, any subvector is also a Gaussian process, right? So if essentially we are working with just the process and its gradients, you could just use this submatrix. If only the second order gradient for this kernel exists, you can use a submatrix and not study curvature and just study the process and its gradients, and say that the covariance kernel of the process, looking at the data, is not smooth enough for me to be able to study second order gradients. All right. Okay. So of course, this gradient, if you think of it, when you're looking at one particular point, this delta is going to 0. So all you basically need is the fourth order derivative to exist at 0. If that is existing, you are good to go, right? Oftentimes, the kernels that we work with are isotropic. What isotropy means is basically it's not dependent upon delta, but the norm of delta. Delta is a vector. Norm of delta is a scalar, right? So oftentimes, that introduces a lot of simplifications, right? And we derive that in the paper that we have. You will see things get a lot more simplified. So looking at this matrix, you can imagine that this might be complicated. How complicated does this really get? The answer, it does not get complicated. When you evaluate this to 0, when you evaluate this at delta tending to 0, because that's what we really need, these matrices are very simple. As you can see, most of the entries for the chosen kernels that we work with the Hutton kernel primarily, right? Because the Hutton kernel is the most commonly used kernel, and it allows you to kind of estimate or put a prior on the amount of so essentially just learn the flexibility or the smoothness that the observed process allows you to estimate, right? So as you can see, when this fractal parameter nu is basically what is quantifying smoothness, because a higher value of nu allows for the process to be a lot smoother. When nu tends to infinity, you get the Gaussian covariance kernel, right? So as you can see, these matrices are really not very complicated at all. These are very simple matrices that you can basically use to estimate these gradients and these curvatures, right? Okay, perfect. So now that we have established that, which is simple enough for anybody to implement, we look at wombling, right? So what this wombling does is basically to evaluate line integrals of these gradients and these curvatures that you can estimate now, right? And so the integral that we are interested in particularly is this, what you see in the first line of the equation, right? So C is basically a boundary of interest, G is any linear functional, which is basically all you need it to be is that directional gradient or directional curvature that you can basically plug in instead of G to estimate the total amount of gradient enclosed by this curve, the total amount of curvature enclosed by this curve. Is this curve forming a boundary in space or not, right? Okay. So if you're just looking at the first integral, that's the total gradient or the total directional curvature. If you're looking at the second one, there's this concept of average directional curvature, right? Because depending upon how large the region is, you don't want the value of that wombling measure, the value of gamma C, to get affected by how large of a region does C enclose, right? So this average curvature or average gradient becomes important. But whenever we're trying to define this average gradient or this average curvature by dividing that by the length of the curve, the concept of length comes in. What should be the length of the curve, right? So it's pretty clear by looking at the spatial domain of reference that this should be the arc length, right? Because that's how you measure the length of curves. So this imposes another condition on the curves that you're working with, that they should be of finite length. They can't be infinite in length, ranging across this entire geographic space that you're working with, all right? And most curves that you work with are of finite length. So this is not really a far-fetched assumption. So if the value of gamma C or gamma bar C is large, we say C is a wombling boundary, or C is a boundary of interest, right? Okay. So this slide basically outlines everything that I just said as an assumption to the curve. You want it to be finite length. You want the normal to the curve to exist. The normal to the curves are essentially functions of the derivative of a parametric curve. And we work with parametric curves. If you remember that slide when I was breaking a smooth curve up into small line segments, those were done using a parametric treatment to the curve, right? So you are at one point, you have a particular direction to get to that point, you move t amounts to get to from one point to the next, right? So it's basically a parametric line segment that you're using to break up a curve, right? And that's all you need. That's all you need for the curve to satisfy, for this to work. All right. Okay. So now once you have this, if you look at instead of that g in that Womling measure that you had, this arbitrary function that you wanted to use, what we are using is basically what we're interested in is directional gradients and directional curvature, right? So they are essentially your gamma 1 tau and gamma 2 tau or gamma 2c, whatever you want to work with, right? Now, again, the red means for the gradient, blue means for the curvature. So as you can clearly see, these are functions of, these are line integrals of Gaussian processes. These line integrals are again broken up into linear segments, which are getting added together. So intuitively, you would again expect that these measures, these Womling measures that you have marked in red and blue, are again dependent Gaussian processes. And that's exactly what happens, right? So through that assumption of Gaussian is so strong that it kind of trickles down through all of this fancy mathematical or differential geometric machinery, if you might call it, to also allow for these gamma 1 and gamma 2, which are Womling measures, to be jointly Gaussian or dependent Gaussian processes, right? And by our assumption of the covariance kernel, the associated covariance kernel with this dependent Gaussian processes can also be derived. But now, mind you, they're on curves. So a Gaussian process assumption on the process on points in a geographic space kind of implies that that strong Gaussian assumption is also translating to lower dimensional structures like curves or segments within the geographic space, right? So that being done and said, for the spatial hierarchical model that we outlined right at the start, under which all of this is happening, we adopt like a Bayesian approach to perform the spatial learning, which is very standard. We hypothesize that the data is generated given a process, a structured process, and which has some parameters of its own. Then the process is observed given those parameters, and there's some priors placed on those parameters, accompanied by hyperparameters, of course. So what you see here is basically color-coded to the different parts of this hierarchical Bayesian model, right? So you have a likelihood, and you have some priors, and you have a structured process. Now, there are efficient versions of this where you can kind of integrate Z out. You really don't need, if you think back, you really don't need to estimate, while writing this out as an MCMC, you really do not need to estimate Z at every step. You could basically just integrate Z out and kind of just learn the process parameters. And then when you're interested in gradients or curvature, do that in the second step, right? Completely separate. So it becomes like a metropolis and then a Gibbs, right? Okay. So once that is done and said, what we really want to do is now go and dive into the gradients. Now, like I said, the main advantage, or if you think the cornerstone for this work to be set up, was that you wanted the process to inform the gradients. You did not want to estimate the gradient standalone outside a process modeling framework, right? So this whole setup allows you to do that. As you can clearly see by these conditional properties where you estimate these gradients Z under the hierarchical modeling setup, given Y, right? So you allow Y to inform the gradients, right? Through this very standard way of doing posterior sampling. So all of these gradients and curvatures are sampled from the posterior. Now, once you can do this, you can apply the same framework to the line integrals, right? Okay. So these are very straightforward once we have established the Bayesian modeling framework and the gradients and the Womling measures, right? Okay. So now all of this is very fancy, nice, and good. This is gymnastics, if you might call it. Let's see if it really works, right? So here, what we want to do is that we want to remind the readers as well as the listeners of this talk is that these gradients and these curvatures do not manifest in real life. They're often induced by a parent spatiotemporal or a parent spatial process, right? Or a spatiotemporal process, if you might extend this to space-time, which we are doing so now. So really what you want to see is that what if the data does not arise from the model that you worked with? Like when I say arise from the model, if I set particular values of phi, sigma square, tau square, I can basically generate data, right, from this hierarchical modeling setup, because that's what I'm hypothesizing. But the data would come from this process, right, and have no true values of gradients and curvatures that we would want to kind of calibrate, like whether we're capturing this, right? If this fancy statistical setup is actually able to capture real world gradients, right? So what we ended up doing was we ended up working with a simulation setup where the true values are available. So you chose some smooth trigonometric patterns, which you could differentiate and get the true values of gradients and curvatures for, right? So we chose two patterns. The first one has no mixed gradients. If you differentiate the mean function of the first pattern with respect to S1 and S2, you would get a value of 0, right? But in the second one, there's a much stronger interaction. There is a dependence in between S1 and S2. If you take mixed gradients with respect to S1 and S2, you would get values, right? So as you can see, the two patterns that are produced are very different from one another, right? And we want to use these patterns, fit that spatial model just with an intercept, right, to see if we can estimate the gradient. So when we fit the model with an intercept, we let that spatially structured process Z capture all of the variation, right? And then you want to estimate the gradients and curvatures on Z, calculate Womling measures on Z, right? So as you can see, our setup works well, right? So the first row is basically the true gradients. The second row is essentially the estimated gradients. You will see points which are color-coded. They are essentially allowing us to do uncertainty quantification. Is the gradient significantly greater than 0 in one location? Because that will allow me to say that this region, this is a peak. Or equivalently, is the gradient significantly negative in a location? This would allow me to say that this is a valley or a trough, right? So within this hierarchical modeling setup, you're able to use those posterior samples for these gradients to calculate highest posterior density intervals or credible intervals, which you can then use to do some uncertainty quantification of whether this is significant, whether this is not, which would not be available if you did not have this Bayesian modeling framework, right? So we just don't do well for the first order gradients. We also do well for the second order gradients. And we show this for the first pattern here. Similar results exist for the second pattern. I'll kind of skip over those due to interest of time. As you can see, the true value of the mixed gradient is 0, and there's nothing significant picked up by this Bayesian MCMC way of capturing gradients, right? But as you can clearly see, the ranges kind of match up. Everything works very well in terms of gradients. And this is crucial because when you're going from, you will be using these gradients inside those line integrals, right? So if something is not working right here, error would kind of overflow there. If there's high variance here, high variance would be seen there as well, right? Okay. These are some diagnostics. So you can see we are kind of working well with this setup. We do the same thing for the second pattern. These are the gradients. The first row is again true gradients. The second row is estimated gradients and true curvature and estimated curvature. The mixed gradients, which is the middle one, is basically non-zero in pattern 2. And as you can see, the ranges again match up, and we're able to do this pretty well with good calibration, right? Okay, so now moving on to Womling. We picked 3 curves. We picked 4 curves, I'm sorry. One is A, B, C, and D. The reason why we picked 4 curves is that if you see D lies in a region which is a contour, these are basically contours that we picked, except for D, which in the software that we provide, it allows the user to kind of use their mouse to pinpoint locations, and it will basically plot a smooth curve through that, which you can then use as a Womling boundary. Okay, so D lies in a flat region, a region where change has started to happen. So you would expect gradients, but you would not expect a lot of curvature. Like the change is starting to happen, but it's not sharp, right? It may be happening at a constant stage, a peak, like a valley is starting to form, right? Which is marked in blue. B and C enclose 2 different peaks. One is maybe a sharper peak than the other, right? So looking at the Womling measures, what we are really looking for in terms of the results is that A should have a very different sign, algebraic sign. A might be negative compared to B and C, right? D should have significant gradients, but not significant curvature, because the change is not very sharp. Change is happening, but it's not sharp, right? And B and C should have different magnitudes. They should be of the same algebraic sign. If they're peaks, then they should be greater than 0, but B should be maybe less than C, right? And that's exactly what we end up seeing in our simulations. What you see in plots A and B, plot A is basically the significant line segments. You remember we used segments that are marked in either blue or in green. Blue means negative, green means positive, right? But they were significant. If you mark them with a color other than white, they were significant, right? So as you can clearly see that most of the regions, most of those rectilinear segments in B, C, and A turned out to be significant because they were bounding peaks, right? Or they were bounding valleys. D was significant in terms of gradients. B is basically for curvature. As you can see, A, B, and C all also have significant curvature, right? Bound significant curvature, that is second order gradients. But D was lying in a flatter zone, right? So there was no sharp changes. Change was happening, but at a very constant rate, right? So most of the segments in the curve D turned out to be not significant in terms of second order gradients, right? But significant in first order gradients, right? So now you can differentiate depending upon that response Y and that modeling framework as to whether change is significant along a line or not, along a curve or not, right? So I think we've kind of achieved what we wanted to achieve right out of those examples, right? Okay, so this is basically quantifying exactly what I explained for those particular curves A, B, C, and D. As you can clearly see that since we can compute, since we are working with smooth trigonometric patterns here, we can calculate the true values of these Vommling measures. So what this table shows you that the true Vommling measures are included actually inside the highest posterior density intervals for the estimated Vommling measures, right? And you can clearly see curves B and C. B enclosed a much flatter peak than C, right? So the gradient of curve C, which was right here, was a much sharper gradient than B. So we are able to differentiate between peaks. Is this a sharper peak? Is this a smaller peak? What is, or is it really a peak? In case of D, since it was not enclosing peaks, the highest posterior density interval actually included zero, right? But in all of the other cases, right, it was basically significant, right? And the same thing could be done for curvature as well, right? So now we kind of look at the motivation and the examples where we applied these to. These kind of prompted the questions to develop a framework like that. And now since we have that framework, we can kind of apply to these to see what's happening, right? So in this case, we had 4 different heavy metals. An ideal framework would be understanding the dependence. As you can clearly see, there's a lot of dependence because there's one river offloading the same metals, right? So you would expect similar concentrations across metals, right? Some dependence across metals. An ideal framework would kind of account for that dependence, right? And that's what we're working on now in terms of, so 2 works going on, which are basically, I'll talk a little bit about in the future work, where we're looking at this in space-time and we're looking at this in a multivariate setup, right? So here, what we do is we fit individual independent spatial models to each heavy metal in terms of concentrations across locations in this river plane, right? And this is again the Meuse River. These locations are on the river plane. We are looking at spatial dependence in concentrations, right? As you can see, we had some covariates as well. The covariates were very interesting in terms of elevation. How far is that location from the river? How frequently does the river flood? What is the soil content, right? Like, is it very salty? Is there a lot of lime content in the soils? All of that was recorded as covariates. So when we fit these models, remember, we had this hierarchical framework which could account for looking at the effect of covariates on the variation in response, right? So as you can clearly see, there are some significant regions where some significant covariates that were detected. But what is very interesting is that when we're looking at the first 3 rows, that kind of shows you the strength of the spatial story, right? So if sigma square is greater than tau square, then the spatial story is very strong. As you can see clearly, in every case, sigma square was greater than tau square. But the magnitude kind of varied, right? Because there was a lot of heterogeneity in the magnitude of the concentrations of these heavy metals detected, right? All of that was picked up, right? So now we kind of evaluate this river as a curve within the spatial surface to see if certain segments of that river show up to as significant when we're evaluating them for gradients or second order gradients in terms of concentrations of heavy metals, right? So the first column, so every row is a heavy metal. The first column is actually the river marked in black and locations which turned out to be significant after we fit our spatial model, right? The second column is basically significant segments of the river in terms of gradients. The third column is significant segments of the river in terms of second order gradients. So like a significant second order gradient means that there is a lot of change, that there is a lot of change happening, and the rate of that change is also significant, right? So it's just a huge amount, like a very rapidly changing region, right? So of course you would expect second order gradients, segments that are being found to be significant for second order gradients, to be subsets of segments to be found as significant for gradients. That's exactly what you see. A lot of regions are significant in terms of gradients, much lesser or subsets being significant in terms of second order gradients. gradients, right? And it's very heterogeneous throughout, like throughout the course of the river. There's a lot of heterogeneity in when you go from one heavy metal to the other in terms of where exactly there is a high gradient or where exactly there is not a high gradient detected, right? So the same thing happens for every other metal. So if you think of it without this gradient or this fancy differential geometry combined with this spatial hierarchical modeling, these two extra columns would not exist, right? You would not be able to evaluate the effect of the river. You would kind of fit your spatial model and then hand wave and talk about all of these gradients in a very non-statistical, non-quantifiable way. But now, since you have this fancy framework, you can actually come up with credible intervals, highest posterior density intervals, estimates, right? Posterior medians, which quantify the amount of response that is enclosed within that region. You can compare. Is the peak formed due to one particular heavy metal less than the others? You can clearly say yes. Maybe zinc forms the strongest, that there is a lot of concentration of zinc, right, compared to the other metals, right? And most of them are essentially happening in certain regions of the river as opposed to the others, right? Okay. Now we did this on the other applications as well, where we had this temperature application. As you can see, we didn't want to include any covariates. We just wanted to have an intercept and let the structured random effect capture all of it. And we were able to now, instead of as a stand-in proxy for these latitudes, we use these contours that are basically horizontal, right? So as you can clearly see that the contours are marked in the first column. Again, the second column is just gradients. The third column is curvature. Depending upon, like, as we move towards the center where not much change is happening, the amount of, like, the proportion of segments that are significant for gradients and curvature keep on changing. As you can see, parts of it, like most of it is very, when we are very close to the middle where things are very flat, the temperatures are almost the same. A lot of the regions in these contours kind of show up to be not significant. But as we move further away in either direction, either north or south, from this middle region, most of the segments of your contours turn out to be significant gradients. And that's exactly what we expect, because a lot more gradients are appearing. Things are getting colder in the north, things are getting hotter in the south, right? Okay. In terms of curvature, again, you see a lot of heterogeneity, right? What was significant in rate for the first set of contours is not significant in the second set, and not in the third set as well, right? Okay. Again, we have this framework allows you to have exact quantitative estimates as posterior medians or highest posterior density intervals to evaluate these boundaries, right? We also did this for the Boston housing data. Now, what's very useful is that, again, here also we had the spatial story was very strong. So sigma square was much larger than tau square. So that just implies that there's a lot of spatial dependence that is affecting the variation inside of your process, right? So as you can see, the posterior estimates are accompanied by their highest posterior density intervals for these process parameters, right? Okay. So what we use, we keep on referring to this differential geometry being used, right? So what differential geometry also allows you to do is, since you have these gradients and these curvatures, you can exactly kind of pinpoint where change is happening, right? And since you have this uncertainty quantification framework that allows you to do so, right? So that there are these quantities that you may be familiar with, which are called divergences and Laplacian. So what the divergence is basically the sum of the pure first order derivatives. What the Laplacian is the sum of the pure second order derivatives, right? So they should be indicative of sharp gradients, sharp curvature, right? And how do we do it? We kind of overlay a grid on the spatial surface and then estimate gradients and curvatures on each of the location of those grids, right? Now, since we have MCMC samples for these gradients, by way of trying to learn spatial variation using a Bayesian approach, you can evaluate these locations of these grid for significance, right? So as you can see, most of the regions of the grid kind of turn out to be significant in terms of divergence and Laplacian, where maximum change is happening. So you see a lot more locations being significant in the gradient, and a subset of those locations significant for curvature. And in terms of significance in terms of curvature, it shows up exactly where the boundary between these two contiguous zones of house price being very high and house price being very low lie, right? Because that's the place where the sharpest amount of change is happening, right? So you would expect that to come with a lot of significant locations for curvature. Okay, perfect. So again, we wanted to look at curves. So we picked the curves exactly by looking at these operators, right? So wherever they turned out to be significant, we kind of looked at contours in those regions. So as you can clearly see, we started out with two contours separating us, the biggest region of low house prices with the biggest region of high house prices. And we evaluated these two curves for gradients and curvatures, right? So as you can see, as we move closer inwards, so from each of these groups of contours, as we move to a little more inside to see if change exists in a much smaller neighborhood, right? As you can clearly see that the gradients and the curvatures kind of keep turning up to be significant, and they turn out to be more significant, increasingly significant as we move closer to the real boundary of change, right? So which essentially lies right in the middle of these regions of red and blue, right? Okay, so like these are the estimates that kind of accompany the curves that you saw here that we evaluated for Wormling boundaries, right? So in conclusion, what we did here was we kind of tried to see the application of boundary analysis. As you can clearly see, they're applicable in many regions of applications and statistics. Right now, the one interesting area that this is being applied to, which I'm involved with, is spatial transcriptomics, where you're interested in basically understanding the location-based effect of gene expression on, let's say, a certain tumor. So it may be breast cancer, it may be the mouse brain, etc. And you're trying to understand the tumor microenvironment, right? So where is the healthy tissue, where is the tumor tissue, depending upon, and understanding the effect of like where the tumor manifests and variation in gene expression due to the manifestation of that tumor, right? So all of that is being done within a Bayesian spatial hierarchical modeling framework, and of course that kind of leads to this use of gradients and curvatures to understand change within the tumor microenvironment, right? We also have publicly available open source software, which is available to be installed in our and it's available on GitHub, right? So we have not yet pushed it to CRAN, since we're kind of wanting to have a unified software which allows you to do multivariate modeling, space-time, as well as this. So this is purely spatial, right? And so, of course, what this really does, if you think of it, is that if you have a spatial surface, what is the exact statistical quantification for this departure from flatness? Flatness just implies no dependence. All variation is random. There's no spatial dependence, right? So if there is spatial dependence, sigma squared is a very crude estimate of the variation. This basically allows you to go down to the point level and understand, okay, this is a region of significant change. That is not. Allows you to differentiate between separate regions inside of the spatial modeling framework, right? Or the spatial reference domain. So since we're assuming a smooth surface, you're really assuming the two order gradients to exist, right? The first and the second. So if you think of a smooth function typically means that the first and the second derivative exists, right? And that's exactly what we wanted to include when completing this boundary analysis framework. So what it was available for was just gradients and simple curves, right? Straight lines. So that the last picture, I think, where you saw the curve being approximated using small segments, is basically what lets you know that if you can do it for a small segment, you can do it for multiple such small segments, and then you can do it for a curve, right? So having the first and the second order gradient inside of this boundary analysis framework is what really completes the framework and completes the boundary analysis perspective of things. All right, here are some of the references, and this paper is available in the Journal of American Statistical Association. It got published last year in January, and feel free to take a read, and I'm always open to questions, right? And I think here is the software or the open source implementation. It's called SP Wormling. If you're looking for it in GitHub, if you type the name of this paper in Google, it'll show up automatically, right? And thank you so much.
Thank you, Aritra, for your seminar. And
Sure,
thank you for giving the name of the package. I was curious. That was my first question. What's the
sure.
where?
Yeah,
Uh, I still suggest you to put on Crandall, even though
yeah,
you think
yeah,
because then you can update it, right? You
yeah,
can always improve it, version as you keep working on this.
yeah,
But anyways, because that becomes very accessible to people. I don't know how much accessible you want to do it since you're still doing research on this.
yeah,
But it's
yeah.
um, well, if people write questions, please do it on the chat. I can read for him. Meanwhile, I have a few questions.
Sure,
Very nice after reading the paper to see talks because it helps us
sure.
to understand a little bit more. So first, does do you have any restrictions in stationarity to your process to be valid on?
That is a very good question. So you do need the process to be weakly stationary. So without that, it won't kind of. But then, uh, what's very interesting is that the stationarity kind of keeps flowing. Like if the original process is stationary, the for this work, it would be interesting to see what happens if it's non-stationary. But for this
Mhm,
work, we kind of assume weak stationarity to make things easier, make our life easier. Because
mhm,
what this work typically entailed was extending what was happening in first order to second order, right? Because working with just gradients, you never really know. Because if you're working with gradients, the gradients, depending upon the direction, like I said, it could be negative as well as positive, right? So you never really know whether if it's a peak or a valley. The second order derivative is what lets you know if it's a peak or a valley, right?
mhm,
So what this work kind of focused on is a simple stochastic process setup, which is offered by assuming weak stationarity and isotropy, uh, uh, to see if we could extend what was happening in gradients to second order gradients, right? And seeing what the inference, like, would the inference become very complicated? So as you can see, it's not too complicated in the spatial case. In the space-time case, it really gets complicated because you have the kernels are not so simple, right? If you're working with a non-separable kernel, it's very really. So again, there as well, we are assuming weak stationarity. But that being said, uh, working with non-stationary processes would be very interesting, right? So, like I mean, to see these exist uh, in non-stationary processes is something that I would look forward to. Yeah,
okay. Second question I have is you depend on that K function, right?
yeah,
And some smoothness on it, probably
yes,
differentiability as well.
exactly.
So said that all these kernels for spatial dependence, they're not necessarily, they do not guarantee a positive, definite process, a
Right.
valid process for any type of distance. Euclidean usually works fine.
Yes.
Geodesic, most of them work like, Matern and this exponential and so on, but
Right.
maybe it doesn't work for geodesic. Oh, maybe work. It's not proven. But if you go further from that, who knows? So you need that key to be valid to whatever distance you want to choose in your process,
Yes.
right? That's a requirement, and still must be smooth enough that it has the derivative up to the fourth derivative. Is that
Yes.
how
For the
far?
full scale to be analyzed, you would want it. So, for instance, the work that you were involved in with Lucas, I think, Lucas and June.
Yeah, yeah. It can
Yeah,
be.
so that was a very interesting work. But you see, what happens is that this is the exact question that allows that kind of looks at. So in the Euclidean distance, you're right. Things are very simple. If you change, like for instance, if you're extending this to manifolds, let's say, where the Euclidean distance, where the manifold in itself is non-Euclidean, right?
Hmm.
So if you're working with the geodesic distance, it really depends upon. So what really gets affected is the normal, right? So for the sake of humoring me, let's say you're working. Let's say the surface of interest is a Mobius strip, right, where the normal kind of shifts from what, like, it changes direction if depending upon where you are on this Mobius strip. If you observe a surface on the Mobius strip, on, let's say you observe a random surface on this Mobius strip, the direction of the normal to the Mobius strip would change when you traverse the surface. Right? That is something that would mess with the gradients. Right?
Yeah.
So
But in our case, we have a problem. I think because a special case is just statistical like you did, but if you're doing with areas, usually you have finite many. That's a restriction. You cannot have infinite many points. It doesn't. I mean,
yes,
infinite many areas. What does that mean? It's a weird.
yeah, yeah.
So
So
yeah.
the surface that you're working with and the metric that is used to metrize the space is something that is very crucial for it to work, because that will directly affect the process, right? So I mean, there's some research for GPs on manifolds, but you would but developing gradients there is also a work that I'm involved in now. Is very complicated, because the first thing that kind of wreaks havoc is, what is the covariance function? Is it
Mm-hmm.
differentiable, right?
Yeah.
So because you, for gradients to exist, you would need it to be twice differentiable. I'm just not even worried about the computation yet, which is of course very, very complicated. Because if you look at it, even for spheres, it doesn't exist. Spheres, if like that was what really surprised me, because you have these large models which are climate models, right, which are predicting uh, how a storm would kind of
Mm-hmm.
path of a storm, or the way a storm traverses a,
Temperature and so on. Yeah.
you would expect gradients to work there. But even for the sphere, the gradients, except one of Grace Wahaba's work, uh, most of it is using the great circle distance, which is not really the right metric for the sphere, right? Because the great circle distance still works with like longitudes and latitudes, so it's not really a true gradient if you're looking at it with
Mm-hmm.
respect to that, right? So literature on this beyond Euclidean is very sparse, very, very sparse.
I see. And finally, that's an applied question. You're mentioning that health problem with the, say, brain images, and
Yeah,
you may have a tumor. Okay,
yeah,
so if you collect that brain image over time, and you have the tumor expanding,
yeah,
probably you can use the curvature to say what direction it will grow and
absolutely.
how fast, and that's one thing you
You're
would like to
exactly
know,
right.
right? If the doctor it's following up, say, oh, it's growing faster, it's growing slower, and
That's
that's
exactly what you
probably
can do.
where it goes in the brain, you can take
Yeah,
some action
that's
on that.
exactly
I'm saying in the brain, but the tumor can be anywhere.
yeah,
Anyway,
like
so you
anyway,
can
right?
try
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
But
that's one application. It might be very interesting
it
because
is, it
a
is.
doctor would love to see that.
Yeah, yeah, that would be very interesting. I mean, that is interesting. But in most cases, what happens with tumors is that there are slices, right? So you have it in 3D, number one. So one application that we're looking at for our space-time work, which is being done, which is almost the verge of completion now, is looking at things like looking at primarily EEG data, right? So what happens with EEG data is that even if you not work with non-separability, let's say you work with a much simpler setup where things are separable, you can still estimate gradients, right? And that's what we are doing now, because for the EEG data, the granularity is very high, right? So there's a high resolution in time, and a little lower resolution in space. So like you have like 64 electrodes which are recording brain signals with respect to, let's say, a stimulus of choice. If it's
Hmm.
alcoholism you're trying to study, you show them pictures of alcohol to see what brain signals are being recorded, and you show them pictures of natural things, right? To understand basically reaction to certain stimuli. So the brain surface is again a manifold, and so we assume it to be Euclidean for now, and these locations are basically on 3D space. The primary challenge is there. These curves in the Euclidean space is simple, but what is a curve on 3D? A curve on 3D, like a hypercurve, right? So a
Hmm.
curve in 3D is basically literature kind of like mathematical formulation for that curve exists. The problem is that understanding change that is being bound by the curve, because the curve is not just like change in the curve is not happening only due to the response, but also due to the curvature of the head, right? Because a curve would kind of change in shape. So if you project that onto the Euclidean space, you could still kind of get away with doing this. That's what we do. But in true sense, if you want to do wobbling on the head, like with EEG data and stuff like that, you like a framework is required for number one, gradients on this manifold again, which is the human skull, and number two, a clear quantification of what curves are, what do curves mean on the skull, right? And if you could do this for the skull, you could do this on like on Earth, like for, let's say, sea surface temperature, right? You could
Yeah,
bound.
I don't know what curve is. I was thinking something like, you get the surface, you grid it out, just the for tumor at least,
Yeah,
like you did for the Boston thing, and
yeah,
then you integrate out this thing, you find the points where the
yeah,
changes are big, and then if it's in the head, probably it's touching the skull, it cannot grow there anymore. So it needs to go to the other direction, right? It
Yeah.
will be pushed by like physical boundaries, but
Yeah.
maybe you can see that in the term. Those are obvious, right?
Yeah.
Because that's you have a problem. So the doctor knows it needs to go here,
Yeah.
but you may find something else.
Yeah.
Who knows? It's still
Yeah.
good. There's a lot of work to be done. That's the
Yes.
good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this area is, I think, for me, very interesting. So
Yeah. And it's nice because it turns,
yeah.
different types of ecological application, medical application, economic
Yes.
application. So,
Yeah.
okay, I don't know. I don't think I have any. I don't see any questions in the chat. Just people saying hello.
Mhm.
So I think we are all set. I will finish the live transmission. Just stay in the studio. I will talk to you a little bit, and then
Sure. Yeah.
um, thank you for accepting the
Thank you so much for
invitation. Maybe
inviting. Always
sharing
a pleasure.
anything.
Always a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah.